First, I want to talk a bit about the different types of synthesis because they're going to be pretty fundamental and foundational to understanding the different ways I design music and sound in this course. The type of synthesis an instrument uses will determine how sound is generated and will ultimately determine what types of sounds you're capable of creating. For example, you're not going to be able to easily make the ES2 sound like a grand piano because the ES2 generates sound with oscillator waveforms, and it's not capable of replicating the sound of a hammer hitting a string like a piano. Whereas you might be able to replicate this sound or get close to it by using a sampler or a physical modeling instrument. So from a broad perspective, there are two main types of synthesis. The first is what's traditionally been called analog synthesis or analog style or analog emulating synthesis. Personally, I find this terminology a bit outdated, so I like to call this oscillator-based synthesis. This means that the instrument can generate tones electrically, like an analog synthesizer, or digitally, like a software synthesizer. But I don't want you to think that all hardware synths are analog and all software synths are digital. It's just not true. There are plenty of digital hardware synthesizers out there, and obviously, because software instruments are within your computer, they're all going to be digital. There's no such thing as an analog software synth, only analog emulating. The key point here is that oscillator-based synthesis generates waveforms that can be modulated, morphed, and affected to get the desired result. Some examples of these would be the retro synth or ES2 in Logic. On the flip side, you have sample-based synthesis. This means that the instrument cannot generate a tone on its own, but rather needs a pre-recorded audio sample or multiple samples to generate sound. Then that signal can be modulated until you get the desired effect. Sample-based instruments in Logic include the sampler, which was previously known as the EXS-24 in earlier versions of Logic, quick sampler, and drum kit designer. Now, there are many different types of synthesis within these main two categories, but I just want to touch on the main ones that I'll be using in this course. Within oscillator-based synthesis, you have subtractive synthesis, additive synthesis, wavetable synthesis, FM or frequency modulation synthesis, physical modeling synthesis, and lastly, analysis resynthesis. With sample-based synthesis, you just have two main categories or types of instruments that use samples. You have samplers, so this would be called sampling, and sample playback instruments, or sample playback synthesis. But there's also a third category, granular synthesis, which is based on sampling, so technically it's a subset of sampling, but I'll put it here as its own distinct type. The specific type of synthesis that an instrument uses determines how it generates sound, and often instruments will employ multiple different types of synthesis. For example, the retro synth in Logic can utilize analog-style subtractive synthesis, wavetable synthesis, or FM synthesis, but you can't use all of these at the same time. The ES2, albeit an older but still reliable instrument in Logic, can utilize subtractive and FM synthesis simultaneously. Sculptor is a physical modeling synthesizer, but it also employs subtractive synthesis and analog-style modulation. So this is a pretty common theme that you'll see, especially with modern software instruments. In the next video, I'll break down each of these types of synthesis in more detail and demonstrate audio examples of each.